Retro video games are a waste of everybody's time and money. Metro.co.uk recently published an article telling us what a waste of time retro video games are for everybody and the negative impact they're having on the video games industry. And I thought, hang on a second, I've got to read through this with you guys and see what on earth they're going on about. Let's check it out. A reader worries that retro gaming is become more mainstream. I mean, first of all, grammar, like your opening sentence. A reader worries that retro gaming is become more mainstream and is encouraging publishers to take less risks in terms of making new games. Now, are we seriously blaming publishers taking less risks on retro games? Retro games which have some of the most ingenious ideas, and when people took the most risks, I think, in gaming, we're blaming those games for modern generation publishers and developers for not taking risks. I think specifically the AAA games we must be talking about. Correct me if I'm wrong. I think the reason that modern games don't take risks is because of the money, of the cash. Obviously, microtransactions, focusing on big glitzy graphics, fear of losing money. We know how much a AAA game costs these days. A bad game can send an entire developer down and mean that they have to just completely cave in and never make any more games if it doesn't sell successfully. I don't think retro games are the issue behind not having new ideas and less risks in video games these days. But anyway, let's crack on. Not a good opening sentence. I've watched the circus surrounding PlayStation Plus Premium with some amusement for the last few weeks, and like everyone, I've been confused as to why it seems so rushed and poorly thought out. I was curious only out of a general interest though, and not because I had any intention of paying for it. I realised a long time ago that I have no interest in retro games, and I'm genuinely surprised to find that anyone else does. Okay, right. So all of a sudden games from a retro generation stop being video games, do they? Like, do we love video games or do we not love video games? That's the way I see it. It's not like, oh, it's retro or it's not. I just love video games. And those video games are still the same games they were 20, 30 years ago. So I don't know, maybe it's just me, but I don't see retro games and video games as different. Like, you draw the line and say, well, I don't like retro games. Anyway, a lot of it is nostalgia, I realise that, but I remember when Microsoft started pushing backwards compatibility and I was excited to put in some of my old OG Xbox discs and see how they looked, and I wish I hadn't, because it killed my sense of nostalgia over them. In short, they looked terrible. There's the first clue. They looked terrible, and in general they played worse, even with enhancements. So the issue for this person with retro video games is that they looked terrible. There's your clue. The problem is people are getting so focused on graphics and how good games are meant to look. That's why AAA developers are not taking as many risks, because they know you want a game that looks good. They know you want these glitzy graphics. And for someone to go back to a retro game and like an OG Xbox game where the graphics were pretty good, to be fair, and say that they look terrible kind of sums up where this article's going, but let's crack on anyway. I'm not surprised that PS Plus Premium has relatively few PlayStation 1 and PlayStation 2 titles, as games from that era just do not stand up as far as I'm concerned. I'm just going to put this out there. Like, I won't even say Metal Gear Solid 1, because maybe you don't like the graphics, the PlayStation 1 polygon graphics. Metal Gear Solid 2, Metal Gear Solid 3, Resident Evil 4, Burnout games. I mean, need I go on? You're telling me those games don't stand up? I'm sorry, I don't agree with that. I think that's perfectly understandable given their age and how quickly the games industry moves on. Did the games industry move on, or are we seeing remakes of a lot of those games? Just with better graphics, might I add, for anyone that's a bit of a graphics junkie. But rather than actually doing that, it seems we're spending more and more time looking backwards, and I don't like it. Good for you, mate. One of the arguments I've seen is that the industry in general doesn't take enough care of its old games, and the current obsession is making up for lost time. That's true to a degree, but the only reason Microsoft started going on about backwards compatibility is that, especially pre-Game Pass, they had nothing else going on, with most of the Xbox One era devoid of big-name games. I'll give them that. I don't think I think Xbox were kind of losing a lot of their customer base, and the old compatibility, backwards compatibility, was a big plus over the PlayStation 5. And in terms of remasters and remakes, well, It's obvious why companies do that. Remasters are cheap and remakes have a built-in audience that ensure the game will always be a hit to at least a certain degree. Now, you just said that games of that generation don't stand up anymore, and you said that the gameplay in those games doesn't even play well even with enhancements, yet you're saying that those games will always be a hit and that they have a built-in audience. So it sounds like this guy's mixing his words a little bit. Now, I will give him the fact that remasters quite often do, or remasters or remakes, I can't get it the right way around. But anyway, one of the types, remasters or remakes, ends up obviously enhancing gameplay and changing a lot of things to make it more modern. So yeah, okay, the gameplay could be improved, but the other one, whether it's remasters or remakes, they tend to just be a glitzy, nice new graphical update. The gameplay would still be the same, so it doesn't really go well with what you were saying before. Anyway, moving on. In other words, retro mean easy. See, I think the guy's written this themselves, because I don't think any professional journalist would make this many mistakes in their article. Anyway, in other words, retro mean easy money. Retro mean easy money, bro. And minimum effort, which is the perfect combination as far as any business is concerned, but I worry that it's starting to have an increasingly negative effect on gaming in terms of being able to move on to new ideas and make things that are more than just sequels or rehashes. I will give him that. I do feel like there's too many remasters and remakes. I do want new ideas, and I think we can all agree on that. I mean, a hot topic quite often is whether we'll get a Metal Gear Solid remake, remaster, or whatever. I don't think we need one. I'm very, very happy jumping back to those old graphics that apparently don't stand up anymore, or that old gameplay that apparently doesn't stand up anymore. I'm very happy going back to that because I love it. And that's what retro is for me. It's nice to see a new, a bit of new effort in an old classic game, but I don't really think we need as many as we get. Tradition is such a damaging concept to innovation, and I think this came to a head with the Starfield reveal recently, where everyone was let down by how similar the game still seemed to be to the ancient Skyrim. Now, I've not seen that. I need to check that out. Rather than making a brand new game, Bethesda has made the same old game just with a new hat on. The excuses are already in place, and I can already predict they'll be saying things like, "We wanted to make sure players still had familiar gameplay they could latch onto," or something similar. Now, this guy needs to realise this isn't indicative of retro games having an impact on modern games. This is indicative of where the industry got about 10 or 15 years ago. I mean, if we realise microtransactions and like this focus on amazing graphics, I really think hit home about 10 years ago. And in the last 10 years, that's when that's when modern video gaming has changed to the point where it's focused so much on money. That isn't impacted by retro games. That's just where the industry is right now. And you're comparing two games from that same kind of era, Skyrim and Starfield, whatever this reveal is. And you can't blame retro games for that. If you want to collect old SNES cartridges or import obscure Saturn games, I totally get that. That's not really what I'm complaining about, although I still wouldn't do it personally. What frustrates me is companies spending a significant amount of time and money bringing back old games that really have nothing to teach us today and are just making it harder and harder to have new ideas. Again, I think that latches onto the remakes and remasters concept, and I would agree with them on that. Have some new ideas, do you know what I mean? Those games were great when they came out and still are. They don't necessarily always need to be remade. We're at the point now where The Last of Us is getting a remake. Is it? Is The Last of Us get a remake? Bloomin' heck. I know it was remastered effectively on the PS4 because it was a PS3 game, wasn't it? But wow. Less than 10 years since it first came out, and despite already having a perfectly good remaster, as we said, just leave it alone. I totally agree with that. And I think that's what the issue is. Last of Us is not a retro game, is it? That's an issue of the current state of AAA gaming, as has existed for the past decade. If you catch up on the story, it's still perfectly playable, and if you're all about gameplay, which I can't imagine is the case with a game like that, The Last of Us Part 2 is already better. Ooh, spicy statement there. I've not played it, but I've heard a lot of people don't think that's the case. Many are rightly upset that Naughty Dog is wasting their time on revamps that don't need to be made, while contemplating making a third game or bringing back Uncharted. Just make something new for heaven's sake. Yep, I agree with that. New IPs are awesome, always. Of course, it's not just Naughty Dog either, but every company from EA going back to games like Dead Space that weren't even particularly big the first time round. Maybe it wasn't big, Dead Space was awesome though. But again, it doesn't really need a remaster, I don't think. Just make it accessible on current consoles. To Nintendo endlessly recycling old Mario and Zelda games. But give it to Nintendo, they recycle old Mario and Zelda games, but they still bring new ones out. You can't really complain about that. And they bring new ones out with some pretty amazing new concepts. I think that's a bit of a harsh point. It always seems like making something new is the absolute last option, as publishers desperately scrape every barrel they can find until they finally admit they have to do something new. And it is getting worse. The more retro gaming is idolized, the less urgency there is to make anything else. I don't know, guys, what do you think? I mean, he makes a good point. I say he, it might be a she. They make a good point about remasters and too many remakes and whatnot. But the reality is that really stopping new IPs and new concepts coming out? Because we are seeing a lot. And maybe those remakes and remasters are just coming out alongside those games, which in and of themselves is not a terrible idea. It does bring old games to a new audience, especially for people like this person who seems to not be able to handle the bad graphics or the lack of gameplay in those retro games. This to me was just an opportunity, a clickbait, a clickbait title of retro video games are a waste of everyone's time and money. Knowing it was going to get people like me to click on, knowing it was going to get people like you to get interested in it, only to then moan about remakes and remasters. I don't know. Retro games are awesome, and they are still, for me, the source of some amazing inspiration. I think indie games in particular, the way they thrive off retro video games is a perfect example of why retro video games are so important and essential, and need to be noticed still need to be focused on to remind us of a time where ingenuity existed purely, and we weren't held hostage to the fact of this game needs to make so many millions, if not billions of dollars for me to then make another game. I mean, like when games like Carmageddon first came out, games like Grand Theft Auto came out in that era of just trying anything, just go as far as you can, think outside the box, bring something new, and just throw new ideas at it. Whereas now, it's now fallen into a place of what is the safest route to make the most amount of money. I say that for AAA games industry. Indie gaming is totally different, and that's what I love so much about it. That's why I love being a part of it and making video games in that world. Is it still enables that ability to make new, fresh ideas and still be openly and proud to be inspired by retro video games. But what do you guys think? That was a pretty funny read if you ask me. I'd love to know what your thoughts are. And once you're done telling me that, check out this awesome episode right here.